Welcome to part 4 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, as reimagined in the style of Kurt Vonnegut. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classic Books Reimagined. If you are enjoying this book, please take a moment to like, share, or subscribe to this channel to get notified when new content posts. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 34, Huck Finn and the Hospitality Hustle.
So there I was, riding into town on a rickety wagon, pondering the twisted fate that had led me this far down the river. Halfway there, I spotted another wagon, and lo and behold, it was Tom Sawyer himself, grinning like a catfish in a bathtub. "Hold on," I yelled, and his wagon screeched to a halt. Tom's jaw dropped like a rusty trap, and he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. "I ain't ever done you no harm. You know that." "So then, what you want to come back and haunt me for?" he stammered. "Tom, I ain't come back from anywhere. I never left," I said, and his face softened a bit, but suspicion lingered in his eyes. "Don't you play nothing on me, because I wouldn't on you." "Honest Injun now, you ain't a ghost?" he asked. "Honest Injun, I ain't," I replied. Well, well, that ought to settle it, of course. But I can't somehow seem to understand it no way. Looky here, weren't you ever murdered at all?" "No, I weren't ever murdered at all. I played it on them. You come in here and feel of me if you don't believe me." He did, and was so relieved to find me alive that he almost squeezed the life out of me right there. He was dying to know every detail, but I told him to hold his horses and listen to my current predicament. He pondered a bit, then snapped his fingers. "Got it. Take my trunk in your wagon and pretend it's yours. You go slow and get to the house when you ought to. I'll come later and pretend we're strangers. Nobody will be the wiser." "All right, but there's one thing, a secret. I'm stealing a slave, Tom. Old Miss Watson's Jim." Tom's eyes lit up like fireworks. "I'll help you steal him," he declared. I nearly fell off the wagon. "You're joking," I said. "I ain't joking either," he insisted. "Well, if you hear anything about a runaway slave, remember, you don't know nothing, and neither do I." With that, we swapped trunks, and Tom set off toward town while I headed back. Naturally, I forgot about going slow. The old man at the door was astounded. "Why, this is wonderful. I wouldn't take $100 for that horse now. I wouldn't, honest. And yet I'd have sold her for 15 before, and thought 'twas all she was worth." I nodded, pretending to care about the horse. Soon enough, Tom's wagon arrived. Aunt Sally spotted it through the window and sent the house into a frenzy of preparation for their rare visitor. Tom strolled up like he owned the place, playing his part to perfection. He addressed the old man with the tip of his hat. "Mr. Archibald Nichols, I presume?" "No, my boy," the old man replied. "Nichols's place is down a matter of 3 miles more. Come in, come in." Tom feigned surprise and gracefully accepted their hospitality. He introduced himself as William Thompson from Hicksville, Ohio, and spun an elaborate tale about his hometown, complete with fictitious characters. At the peak of his performance, he leaned over and kissed Aunt Sally right on the mouth. She reacted like she'd been stung by a wasp. "You audacious puppy!" she yelled. "I'm surprised at you, ma'am," Tom said, feigning innocence. "What do you mean by kissing me?" she demanded. "I didn't mean nothing, ma'am. I thought you'd like it." "Why, you born fool!" She looked ready to smack him, but restrained herself. "Who told you I'd like it?" "Everybody," Tom said. "They all said you would." Aunt Sally was fit to be tied, but the old man stepped in, and after much confusion, the truth came out. Tom revealed his true identity, and Aunt Sally's fury melted into joy. She hugged him, kissed him, and soon enough, the family was laughing and feasting. Dinner was a grand affair with enough food for an army. Uncle Silas blessed the meal with a prayer so long, it could have put a sermon to shame, but it was worth the wait. After dinner, the conversation flowed, but Tom and I were on edge. listening for any mention of a runaway slave. Finally, at supper, one of the boys brought up the show. Pa, mayn't Tom and Sid and me go to the show? No, the old man said. I reckon there ain't going to be any, and you couldn't go if there was. The runaway black dude told Burton and me all about that scandalous show, and Burton said he would tell the people. So I reckon they've driven the loafers out of town by now. So that was it. Tom and I went to bed early, slipped out the window, and hurried into town. On the way, Tom told me about my supposed murder, Pap's disappearance, and Jim's escape. I filled him in on our raft adventures. We were almost to the town square when we heard the commotion, torches, whooping, tin pans banging. We stepped aside to let the mob pass and saw the king and the duke, tarred, feathered, and riding a rail. They looked like grotesque parade floats, and it made me sick. I felt sorry for them. Pitiful rascals that they were. Human beings can be awfully cruel to one another. We asked around and learned the town had planned their revenge perfectly. They waited until the king was on stage, then ambushed them. Tom and I headed back, feeling humbled and guilty, even though we'd done nothing wrong. Conscience, that useless thing, wouldn't leave me alone. Tom felt the same. And so, we walked back in the dark, ready for whatever came next, knowing our adventures were far from over.
Chapter 35, Witchy Hut Hijinks and Lightning Rod Shenanigans.
We stopped our grand philosophical debate and got to the serious business of thinking. After a while, Tom pipes up, Huck, what fools we've been not to think of this before. I bet I know where Jim is. No kidding, where? In that hut down by the ash hopper. Remember at dinner that fellow went in there with some victuals? Yeah. And what did you think the victuals were for? A dog, I guess. Exactly, but part of it was watermelon. Well, slap me silly, you're right. It does beat all that. I never thought about a dog not eating watermelon. Makes you realize how a body can see and not see at the same time. Exactly. The guy unlocked the padlock, went in, and locked it again. He handed Uncle the key right after dinner. Watermelon means human. Lock means prisoner. It's not likely they've got two prisoners on such a small plantation where everyone's so nice and hospitable. Jim's the prisoner. We figured it out detective style. Now, you come up with a plan to bust Jim out, and I'll think up one too. We'll go with the best one. What a head Tom had. If I had Tom Sawyer's head, I wouldn't trade it for being a duke or the mate of a steamboat or a circus clown or anything. I started thinking up a plan just to pass the time because I knew the right plan was going to come from Tom. Sure enough, soon Tom says, Ready? Yep, I says. All right, lay it out. My plan is this. We sneak down, see if it's Jim in there, then get my canoe and fetch my raft. First dark night, we swipe the key from the old man's breeches. Shove off down the river with Jim, hiding by day, floating by night, just like before. That'll work, won't it? Work? Of course it'll work. But it's too darn simple. It's got no pizzazz, no style. It's as bland as boiled cabbage. Where's the fun in that? I didn't say anything because I knew better. When Tom got his plan ready, it wouldn't have any of those problems. And it didn't. He told me his plan, and I saw right away it was worth 15 of mine for style. It would free Jim just as well, and maybe get us all killed in the process. I was satisfied and said we'd go with it. I won't detail it here because I knew Tom would change it every which way as we went along, adding new wrinkles and whatnot. And that's what he did. One thing was for sure. Tom Sawyer was dead serious about helping steal Jim out of slavery. That baffled me. Here was a boy who was respectable, had a reputation to protect, and folks at home who cared about their good name. Yet here he was, ready to stoop to this and disgrace himself and his family. I couldn't understand it. It was outrageous, and I knew I ought to tell him so and be a true friend. I started to, but he shut me up. Don't you reckon I know what I'm about? Don't I generally know what I'm about? Yes. Didn't I say I was going to help steal the dude? Yes. Well then, that was that. When Tom said he'd do something, he always did it. I couldn't figure out why he was willing to do this, so I let it go and stopped worrying. If he was bent on it, I couldn't stop him. When we got home, the house was dark and still. We went down to the hut by the ash hopper to check it out. We passed through the yard to see what the hounds would do. They knew us and didn't make any more noise than usual. When we reached the cabin, we checked the front and sides. On the north side, we found a window hole with one stout board nailed across it. Here's the ticket, I said. This hole's big enough for Jim if we wrench off the board. Tom says, it's as simple as tic-tac-toe, 3 in a row, and as easy as skipping school. We can do better than that, Huck Finn. Then how about we saw him out like I did before? That's more like it. It's mysterious and troublesome, but I bet we can find something twice as long and twice as complicated. No hurry, let's keep looking. Between the hut and the fence, there was a lean-to, about 6 feet wide. The door was padlocked. Tom found a tool to pry out a staple. The chain fell and we opened the door. Inside, it was just a shed with old tools and no connection to the cabin. Tom was thrilled. Now we're all set. We'll dig him out. It'll take about a week. We headed back to the house. I went in through the back door, but Tom insisted on climbing the lightning rod. He tried 3 times and nearly killed himself each time. Finally, he made it. In the morning, we were up early, down at the slave cabins to make friends with the dog feeder. He was a cheerful, superstitious fellow, with his wool tied up to keep witches off. He got so worked up about witches that he forgot what he was doing. Tom asked, "What's the victuals for? Gonna feed the dogs?" The guy smiled slowly like a brick sinking in a mud puddle. "Yes, Mars Sid, a dog, Curus dog. You want to see?" "Yes." I nudged Tom and whispered, "Are we doing this in broad daylight?" "No, it's the plan now." We went along, and when we got inside, it was dark. Jim saw us and sang out, "Why, Huck, ain't that Misto Tom?" I expected it. I froze, but the guy said, "Why, the gracious sakes, do he know you, gentlemen?" Tom looked puzzled and said, "Does who know us?" "This your runaway slave." "I don't reckon he does. What put that into your head?" "Didn't he just sing out like he knowed you?" Tom, acting all puzzled, said, "Well, that's mighty curious. Who sung out? When did he sing out? What did he sing out?" He turned to me. "Did you hear anyone?" I said, "No, I didn't hear anything." Tom turned to Jim. "Did you sing out?" "No, sah." "Not a word?" "No, sah." "Ever see us before?" "No, sah." Tom turned to the guy. "What's wrong with you? What made you think someone sang out?" "It's the witches, sah. They skeer me so. Don't tell nobody or old Mars Silas, he'll scold me." Tom gave him a dime and told him to buy more thread for his hair. Then he whispered to Jim, "Don't let on you know us. If you hear digging at night, it's us setting you free." Jim squeezed our hands. The guy came back, and we said we'd visit again, especially if it was dark. And then we left, plotting the next steps of our outrageous plan.
Chapter 36, Escapology for Dummies, a satirical guide to freedom.
Breakfast was still an hour away, so we ducked into the woods. Tom said we needed light to see how to dig, but not too much light. A lantern was too risky. Instead, we gathered a bunch of those rotten chunks called foxfire. They glowed just enough in the dark to be spooky without being practical. We hid them in the weeds and sat down to rest. Tom was grumbling. "Blame it, Huck. This whole situation is as easy as tripping over your own feet. No watchman to drug, no dog to knock out with sleeping pills. Just Jim, chained by one leg to a bed. All we have to do is lift the bed and slip off the chain, and Uncle Silas trusts everyone, so the key is practically hanging on a free Jim sign." "Yeah, but then how are we going to turn this into a high-stakes, best-selling prison break?" Tom continued, eyes gleaming with the craziness of a Victorian adventure novelist. "We've got to create difficulties. We need drama. Heck, even a lantern is too simple. We could probably use a torchlight parade if we wanted to, but where's the flair in that? We need a saw, Huck. A saw? For what? I asked. Why, to saw off the leg of Jim's bed, of course. You really think lifting the bed and slipping the chain off is good enough? Have you ever read a book? Baron Trenck, Casanova, Benvenuto Cellini? They all did it the hard way, the proper way. Saw the bed leg in two, swallow the sawdust, and cover the cut with dirt and grease so it's invisible. Then, when the time is right, kick the leg, slip the chain, shinny down a rope ladder, break your leg in the moat, because the ladder's always too short, and voila. You're off to your homeland triumphant. What do we want a moat for, I asked, when we're sneaking him out from under the cabin? Tom was off in his own world, dreaming of heroic escapades. No, sawing Jim's leg off wouldn't do, he muttered to himself. No necessity for it. Thank goodness, I said. Why would you even think of sawing his leg off? Well, some of the best authorities did it. They couldn't get the chain off, so they cut their hand off. A leg would be even better, but we'll let that go. Jim's a slave and wouldn't understand the sophisticated European reasoning behind it. But he definitely needs a rope ladder hidden in a pie. That's standard procedure. Tom, Jim doesn't need a rope ladder, I protested. He does. He can hide it in his bed. It's a clue for the authorities, Huck. You have to leave clues behind. It's all part of the escape mystique. Fine, but if we start tearing up sheets, Aunt Sally's going to skin us alive. Why not use hickory bark? It's just as good and it doesn't waste anything. Tom gave me a look that could curdle milk. Hickory bark ladder? For a state prisoner? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. All right. If we're following the book, we're following the book. But borrowing a sheet is better than explaining a hickory bark ladder. Tom agreed and added, borrow a shirt too. Jim needs to keep a journal. Journal? Jim can't write. Who cares? He can make marks. We'll make him a pen out of a pewter spoon or an old iron barrel hoop. Why not use a goose feather? Because prisoners don't have geese running around their dungeons, you muggins. They make pens out of whatever tough, inconvenient materials they can find. It's tradition. What about ink? Iron rust and tears, or better yet, blood. It's what the best authorities use. Jim can write messages on tin plates and throw them out the window. That's classic prison protocol. But Jim doesn't have tin plates. He gets fed in a pan. Then we'll get him some. Who's going to read it? It doesn't matter, Huck. The point is to do it right. We heard the breakfast horn and headed back to the house. After breakfast, I borrowed a sheet and a shirt from the clothesline, put them in a sack with the foxfire, and called it borrowing, though Tom insisted it was stealing since we were representing prisoners. He said it was our right as prisoners to take whatever we needed to escape. Later, Tom carried the sack into the lean-to while I kept watch. He returned and we sat on the woodpile to plan. Everything's set except tools, Tom said. Tools? Yes, to dig with. We're not gnawing him out, are we? Those old picks and shovels aren't good enough? Huck, do you ever hear of a prisoner having modern tools? They dig with case knives through rock if necessary. It takes weeks and weeks. Heroes do it the hard way. We need case knives. To dig the foundations out with case knives? That's ridiculous, Tom. It doesn't matter how foolish it is. It's the right way, the regular way. I've read all the books. They always dig with case knives, and it takes forever. It's what makes it heroic. How long will it take, Tom? We can't risk it taking too long. Uncle Silas will find out about Jim. We need to dig fast, but we can pretend that it took 37 years. That way we can snatch Jim at the first alarm and rush him away. That makes sense. Pretending doesn't cost anything. Exactly. Go get 3 case knives. We need 1 to make a saw. If it's not too unorthodox, I said, there's an old saw blade by the smokehouse. Tom looked exasperated. Just get the knives, Huck. So I did.
Chapter 37. The Lightning Rod. A Legacy of Lunacy. The Art of Doing Nothing Perfectly.
As soon as we reckoned everyone was nestled snug in their beds, we went down the lightning rod. A descent only for the brave or the profoundly idiotic, and shut ourselves up in the lean-to, got out our pile of foxfire, and got to work. We cleared everything out of the way, about 4 or 5 feet along the middle of the bottom log. Tom said he was right behind Jim's bed now, and we'd dig in under it. When we got through, nobody in the cabin would know there was any hole there because Jim's counterpin hung down almost to the ground. You'd have to lift it up and look under to see the hole. So we dug and dug with the case knives till near midnight. Our hands were blistered, and yet you couldn't see we'd done much of anything. Finally, I says, "This ain't no 37-year job. This is a 38-year job, Tom Sawyer." He didn't say nothing, just sighed and thought a while. Then he says, "It ain't no use, Huck. It ain't a-going to work. If we were prisoners, it would, because then we'd have years to work on it. We wouldn't get but a few minutes to dig every day while they were changing watches, and our hands wouldn't get blistered. We could keep it up right along, year in and year out, and do it right. But we got to rush. We ain't got no time to spare. If we put in another night like this, we'd have to knock off for a week to let our hands heal." "Well, then, what we gonna do, Tom?" "I'll tell you. It ain't right and it ain't moral, and I wouldn't like it to get out. But there ain't only just the one way. We got to dig 'em out with the picks and let on it's case knives." "Now you're talking," I says. "Your head gets leveler and leveler all the time, Tom Sawyer. Picks is the thing, moral or no moral. And as for me, I don't care shucks for the morality of it. When I start in to steal a slave or a watermelon or a Sunday school book, I ain't particular how it's done, so it's done. What I want is my slave or my watermelon or my Sunday school book. And if a pick's the handiest thing, that's the thing I'm going to use. I don't give a dead rat what the authorities think about it." "Well," he says, "there's an excuse for picks and letting on in a case like this. If it weren't so, I wouldn't approve of it, nor stand by and see the rules broke. Because right is right, and wrong is wrong. A body ain't got no business doing wrong when he knows better. It might answer for you to dig Jim out with a pick without any letting on, because you don't know better. But it wouldn't for me, because I do know better. Give me a case knife." He had his own by him, but I handed him mine. He flung it down and says, "Give me a case knife." I didn't know just what to do, but then I thought. I scratched around amongst the old tools, got a pickaxe, and handed it to him. He took it, went to work, and never said a word. He was always just that particular and full of principle. So then I got a shovel, and we picked and shoveled, turnabout, making the fur fly. We stuck to it for about a half hour, as long as we could stand, and we had a good-sized hole to show for it. When I got upstairs, I looked out the window and saw Tom doing his level best with the lightning rod. But he couldn't manage it. His hands were too sore. At last he says, "It ain't no use. It can't be done. What do you reckon I better do? Can't you think of a way?" "Yes," I says, "but I reckon it ain't regular. Come up the stairs and let on it's a lightning rod." So he'd done it. The next day, Tom stole a pewter spoon and a brass candlestick to make pens for Jim and 6 tallow candles. I hung around the blacks' cabins, laid for a chance, and stole 3 tin plates. Tom said it wasn't enough, but I said nobody would ever see the plates Jim threw out because they'd fall in the dog fennel and Jimson weeds under the window hole. We could tote them back and use them over again. Tom was satisfied. Then he says, "Now the thing to study out is how to get the things to Jim." "Take them in through the hole," I says, "when we get it done." He only looked scornful and said nobody ever heard of such an idiotic idea. Then he went to studying. By and by, he said he had ciphered out 2 or 3 ways, but there wasn't no need to decide on any of them yet. Said we'd got to post Jim first. That night we went down the lightning rod a little after 10, took one of the candles along, and listened under the window hole. We heard Jim snoring, so we pitched the candle in, and it didn't wake him. Then we whirled in with the pick and shovel, and in about 2.5 hours, the job was done. We crept in under Jim's bed and into the cabin, pawed around, found the candle, lit it, and stood over Jim for a while. He was looking hearty and healthy. Then we woke him up gently. He was so glad to see us, he almost cried. He called us honey and all the pet names he could think of. and wanted us to hunt up a cold chisel to cut the chain off his leg right away and clear out without losing any time. But Tom showed him how unregular it would be, sat down and told him all about our plans and how we could alter them in a minute if there was an alarm, and not to be afraid because we would see he got away. Sure. Jim said it was all right, and we sat there and talked over old times for a while. Then Tom asked a lot of questions, and when Jim told him Uncle Silas came in every day or two to pray with him, and Aunt Sally came in to see if he was comfortable and had plenty to eat, and both of them were as kind as they could be, and Tom says, "Now I know how to fix it. We'll send you some things by them." I said, "Don't do nothing of the kind. It's one of the most jackass ideas I ever struck." But he never paid no attention to me. He went right on. It was his way when he'd got his plans set. So he told Jim how he'd have to smuggle in the rope ladder pie and other large things by Nat, the dude that fed him. And he must be on the lookout and not be surprised, and not let Nat see him open them. We would put small things in Uncle Silas's coat pockets, and he must steal them out. And we would tie things to Aunt Sally's apron strings or put them in her apron pocket if we got a chance, and told him what they would be and what they were for. He told him how to keep a journal on the shirt with his blood and all that. Jim couldn't see no sense in most of it, but he allowed we were white folks and knew better than him. So he was satisfied and said he would do it all just as Tom said. Jim had plenty of corn cob pipes and tobacco, so we had a right down good sociable time. Then we crawled out through the hole and went home to bed with hands that looked like they'd been chewed on. Tom was in high spirits. He said it was the best fun he ever had in his life and the most intellectual. He said if he could see his way to it, we'd keep it up all the rest of our lives and leave Jim to our children to get out, because he believed Jim would come to like it better and better the more he got used to it. He said that in that way it could be strung out to as much as 80 years and would be the best time on record. And he said it would make us all celebrated that had a hand in it. In the morning, we went out to the woodpile, chopped up the brass candlestick into handy sizes, and Tom put them and the pewter spoon in his pocket. Then we went to the blacks' cabins. While I distracted Nat, Tom shoved a piece of candlestick into the middle of a corn pone in Jim's pan. We went along with Nat to see how it would work, and it just worked noble. When Jim bit into it, it almost mashed all his teeth out, and nothing could have worked better. Tom said so himself. Jim never let on, but what it was just a piece of rock or something like that. That's always getting into bread, you know. But after that, he never bit into nothing without jabbing his fork into it in 3 or 4 places first. And while we were standing there in the dim light, here come a couple of hounds bulging in from under Jim's bed, and they kept on piling in until there were 11 of them. There wasn't hardly room to breathe. By jings, we forgot to fasten that lean-to door. The dude Nat hollered, "Witches," once, keeled over on the floor amongst the dogs, and began to groan like he was dying. Tom jerked the door open, flung out a slab of Jim's meat, and the dogs went for it. In 2 seconds, he was out and back again, shutting the door. I knew he'd fix the other door, too. Then he went to work on Nat, coaxing and petting him, and asking if he'd been imagining things again. Nat raised up, blinked his eyes around, and says, "Mars Sid, you'll say I's a fool, but if I didn't believe I saw most 1,000,000 dogs or devils or something, I wish I may die right here in these tracks. I did, most surely. Mars Sid, I felt them, sah. They was all over me. Dad fetch it. I just wish I could get my hands on one of them witches just once. Only just once. It's all I'd ask. But mostly, I wish they'd leave me alone, I does." Tom says, "Well, I tell you what I think. What makes them come here just at this runaway slave's breakfast time? It's because they're hungry. That's the reason. You make them a witch pie. That's the thing for you to do." "But my land, Mars Sid, how's I gwine to make 'em a witch pie? I don't know how to make it. I ain't ever heard of such a thing before." "Well, then I'll have to make it myself." "Will you do it, honey? Will you? I'll worship the ground under your foot. I will." "All right, I'll do it, seeing it's you, and you've been good to us and showed us the runaway slave. but you got to be mighty careful. When we come around, you turn your back, and then whatever we've put in the pan, don't you let on you see it at all. And don't you look when Jim unloads the pan. Something might happen. I don't know what. And above all, don't you handle the witch things. Handle 'em, Mars, Sid? What is you talking about? I wouldn't lay the weight of my finger on 'em. Not for $100,000 billion, I wouldn't. So we left Nat to ponder the wisdom of pie making for witches and slipped out, the two of us laughing quietly, conspirators in our absurd adventure.
Chapter 38, The Great Escape Recipe, A Witch Pie Delight.
With everything arranged, we ventured to the backyard junk pile, a treasure trove of discarded dreams, old boots, rags, broken bottles, and tin scraps. There, we unearthed an old tin washpan and patched the holes best we could. This would be our pie pan. We sneaked it down to the cellar, filled it with flour, and headed for breakfast. On the way, Tom found a couple of shingle nails. He said they'd be perfect for a prisoner to scratch his name and sorrows on the dungeon walls. He deftly slipped one into Aunt Sally's apron pocket and the other into Uncle Silas's hatband, because the kids mentioned their folks were visiting the runaway slave's house this morning. Then we went to breakfast. Aunt Sally arrived red-faced and fuming, barely containing her irritation long enough for the blessing. She began pouring coffee with one hand and swatting the closest child's head with her thimble-wielding other hand. "I've hunted high and I've hunted low, and it beats all what's become of your other shirt." My heart plummeted to my stomach, followed by a hard piece of corn crust that shot across the table and smacked one of the kids in the eye, making him howl like a war whoop. Tom turned an impressive shade of blue around the gills. The commotion lasted only a quarter of a minute, but it felt like eternity. Uncle Silas chimed in, looking bewildered. "It's most uncommon curious. I can't understand it. I know perfectly well I took it off because you've only got one shirt on. Just listen at the man. I know you took it off. I saw it on the clothesline yesterday, but now it's gone. You'll have to wear the red flannel one until I can make a new one. This will be the third shirt I've made in 2 years. A body would think you'd learn to take care of them by now." "I try, Sally, I really do, but I only see them when they're on me. I don't believe I've ever lost one off of me." "Well, if you haven't, it's not for lack of trying, and it's not just the shirt. The spoon's gone too. There were 10, now there are 9. The calf might have gotten the shirt, but the calf didn't take the spoon." "What else is gone, Sally?" 6 candles. The rats could have taken the candles, but not the spoon. That's certain." "Well, I'm in fault, Sally. I admit it. I've been remiss. But I'll stop those rat holes tomorrow." "Oh, don't hurry. Next year will do. Matilda Angelina Airman to Phelps." A thimble whack landed on one of the kids, making her snatch her claws out of the sugar bowl. Just then, the cook stepped in. "Mrs., they's a sheet gone." "A sheet gone? Well, for the land's sake." "I'll stop up them holes today," Uncle Silas said, looking sorrowful. "Oh, shut up. Do you think the rats took the sheet? Where's it gone, Liz?" "Cloud of goodness, I hain't no notion, Miss Sally. She was on the clothesline, yes, stiddy, but she done gone." "I reckon the world is coming to an end. I never seen the like. A shirt, a sheet, a spoon, 6 candles." "Mrs.," interrupted a young servant, "dey's a brass candlestick missing. Clear out of here, you hussy, or I'll take a skillet to you." She was furious. I considered sneaking out to hide in the woods until the storm passed, but she kept on raging, everyone else meek and quiet. Finally, Uncle Silas, looking sheepish, fished the spoon out of his pocket. Aunt Sally stopped, gaping, and I wished I was in Jerusalem or anywhere but there. "It's just as I expected. You had it in your pocket all the time. How did it get there?" "I don't know, Sally. I was studying my text in Acts 17 before breakfast. I must have put it in my pocket by mistake, thinking it was my testament." "Oh, for the land's sake, give me a rest. Go on now, all of you, and don't come near me until I've got my peace of mind back." I'd have obeyed her even if I'd been dead. As we passed through the sitting room, Uncle Silas's hat fell, and the shingle nail dropped out. He picked it up absent-mindedly and put it on the mantel, saying nothing. Tom saw and remarked, "Well, it ain't no use sending things by him no more. He ain't reliable. But he did us a good turn with the spoon, so we'll return the favor and stop up his rat holes." We went to the cellar and spent an hour doing the job tight and shipshape. When we heard steps on the stairs, we blew out our light and hid. Uncle Silas came in mumbling about rats and wandered around in a daze, checking holes. Finally, he sighed. "Well, for the life of me, I can't remember when I done it. I could show her now that I wasn't to blame, but never mind, let it go." Tom fretted about finding another spoon, but he said we had to have it. We waited by the spoon basket until Aunt Sally came in. Tom counted the spoons and laid them out, while I slid one up my sleeve. "Aunt Sally, there ain't but 9 spoons yet. Go on to your play and don't bother me. I know better. I counted them myself." Well, I've counted them twice and I can't make but 9. She came over to count, exasperated. "I declare to gracious there ain't but 9. What in the world? Plague take the things, I'll count them again." I slipped the spoon back, and when she finished counting, she said, "Hang the troublesome rubbish. There's 10 now." "Aunt Sally, I don't think there's 10. "You numbskull, didn't you see me count 'em?" "I know, but..." "Well, I'll count 'em again." I swiped another spoon and they came out 9 again. She was trembling with fury, counting and recounting until she got so mixed up, she started counting the basket for a spoon. 3 times they came out right, 3 times wrong. She finally threw the basket across the room, knocking the cat sideways. "Clear out and let me have some peace, or I'll skin you alive." We dropped the spoon in her apron pocket as she gave us our sailing orders. Jim got the spoon and the shingle nail before noon. Tom was delighted. He said Aunt Sally would never count spoons the same again. That night, we put the sheet back on the line, stole another, and kept switching them until she lost track and didn't care anymore. As for the candlestick, it would blow over. But that pie was a nightmare. We made it in the woods, using up 3 washpans of flour, burning ourselves and our eyes with smoke. We couldn't get the crust right until we decided to bake the rope ladder in the pie. We tore up a sheet into strings, twisted them together, and by dawn, we had a rope that could hang a man. We let on it took 9 months to make. We hid the pie with the rope inside in Jim's pan. He got it and hid the rope in his straw tick, scratching marks on a tin plate and throwing it out the window hole. All was set for the grand escape.
Chapter 39, The Ludicrous Coat of Arms, The Supreme Superintendent, Gloriously Unpleasant, A Tearjerker Extravaganza.
Making those pens was a job worthy of a Greek tragedy, and the saw was no better. Jim reckoned the inscription would be the worst of all. That's the one the prisoner has to scrawl on the wall, right next to his coat of arms. Tom was adamant about the necessity of this. He said it was practically a law of nature that no state prisoner worth his salt left behind without a noble inscription and an equally noble coat of arms. "Look at Lady Jane Grey," Tom said. "Look at Guilford Dudley. Look at old Northumberland. Huck, suppose it is a bit of trouble. What are you going to do? You can't just skip it. Jim's got to have his inscription and coat of arms. It's tradition." Jim protested. "Why, Mars, Tom, I ain't got no coat of arms. I ain't got nothing but this old shirt, and you knows I got to keep the journal on that." "Oh, you don't understand, Jim. A coat of arms is something different," Tom said with the patience of a saint. "Well," I said, "Jim's right. He doesn't have a coat of arms." "I reckon _I_ know that," Tom snapped. "But you bet he'll have one before he leaves here. He's going out right, and there won't be any flaws in his record." So while Jim and I filed away at the pens, Tom sat down to invent a coat of arms. He came up with so many ideas, he didn't know which to choose. Finally, he said, "We'll have a bend or in the Dexter base, a saltire Murray in the fess, with a dog, couchant, for common charge, and under his foot a chain embattled for slavery, with a chevron vert in a chief engrailed, and 3 invected lines on a field azure, with the nombril points rampant on a dancet indented. Crest, a runaway slave, sable, with his bundle over his shoulder on a bar sinister, and a couple of ghouls for supporters. Those will be you and me. Motto: Maggiore fretta, minore atto. Got it out of a book. Means the more haste, the less speed. Gee whiz, I said, but what does the rest of it mean? We ain't got time to bother over that, Tom said. We got to dig in like all get out. Well, anyway, I said, what's some of it? What's a fess? A fess is. You don't need to know what a fess is. I'll show him how to make it when he gets to it. Shucks, Tom, I said. I think you might tell a person. What's a bar sinister? Oh, I don't know. But he's got to have it. All the nobility does. That was just his way. If he didn't want to explain something, he wouldn't. You could pump him for a week, and it wouldn't make any difference. He got the coat of arms all figured out and started on the mournful inscription. Said Jim had to have one, like all the great prisoners. He wrote out several and read them to us. 1. Here, a captive heart busted. 2. Here a poor prisoner, forsook by the world and friends, fretted out his sorrowful life. 3. Here a lonely heart broke and a worn spirit went to its rest, after 37 years of solitary captivity. 4. Here, homeless and friendless, after 37 years of bitter captivity, perished a noble stranger, natural son of Louis XIV. Tom's voice trembled as he read them, nearly breaking down. When he finished, he couldn't decide which one Jim should scrawl on the wall. They were all so good. Finally, he decided Jim should do them all. Jim said it would take a year to scrawl that much on the logs with a nail, and he didn't know how to make letters besides. But Tom said he'd block them out for him, and all Jim had to do was follow the lines. Then Tom said, "Come to think, the logs won't do. They don't have log walls in a dungeon. We got to carve the inscriptions into a rock. We'll fetch a rock." Jim said the rock would be worse than the logs. It would take him forever to carve into a rock. But Tom said I could help. He checked on our progress with the pens. It was tedious, slow work, and our hands were raw. So Tom says, "I know how to fix it. We need a rock for the coat of arms and inscriptions, and we can kill 2 birds with that same rock. There's a big grindstone at the mill. We'll smouch it, carve the things on it, and file out the pens and saw on it, too." It wasn't a bad idea, and it wasn't a small grindstone either, but we decided to tackle it. It wasn't quite midnight yet, so we cleared out for the mill, leaving Jim at work. We smouched the grindstone and set out to roll it home. It was a tough job, and it nearly mashed us every time it tipped over. Tom said it was sure to get one of us before we were through. We got it halfway home, then we were played out and drenched with sweat. We had to go fetch Jim. So he raised his bed, slid the chain off the bed leg, wrapped it around his neck, and we crawled out through our hole. Jim and I laid into that grindstone and walked it along like nothing, with Tom superintending. He could out-superintend any boy I ever saw. He knew how to do everything. Our hole was big, but not big enough for the grindstone. Jim took the pick and soon made it big enough. Then Tom marked the things on it with a nail and set Jim to work, with the nail as a chisel and an iron bolt for a hammer. Tom told him to work until his candle burned out, then go to bed and hide the grindstone under his straw tick and sleep on it. Then we helped him fix his chain back on the bed leg and got ready for bed ourselves. But Tom thought of something and said, "You got any spiders in here, Jim?" "No, sir. Thanks to goodness I hain't, Mars Tom." "All right, we'll get you some." "But bless you, honey, I don't want none. I just as soon have rattlesnakes around." Tom thought for a minute and said, "It's a good idea. It stands to reason." "Yes, it's a prime good idea. Where could you keep it?" "Keep what, Mars Tom?" "Why, a rattlesnake." "To goodness gracious alive, Mars Tom. Why, if dey was a rattlesnake to come in here, I'd bust right out through that log wall, I would with my head." "Why, Jim, you wouldn't be afraid of it after a little. You could tame it." "Tame it?" "Yes, easy enough. Every animal is grateful for kindness and petting. They wouldn't underscore. Think underscore. of hurting a person who pets them. Any book will tell you that. You try, that's all I ask, just try for 2 or 3 days. Why, you can get him so in a little while that he'll love you and sleep with you, and won't stay away from you a minute, and we'll let you wrap him around your neck and put his head in your mouth. Please, Mars Tom, don't talk so. I can't underscore stand it. He'd underscore let underscore me, shove his head in my mouth. For a favor, hain't it? I lay he'd wait a powerful long time before I asked him, and more than that, I don't want him to sleep with me. Jim, don't act so foolish. A prisoner's got to have some kind of dumb pet. If a rattlesnake hasn't been tried, there's more glory in your being the first to try it than any other way you could think of. Why, Mars Tom, I don't want no such glory. Snake takes and bites Jim's chin off. Then where's the glory? No, sah, I don't want no such doings. Blame it, can't you try? I only want you to try. You needn't keep it up if it doesn't work. But the trouble's all done if the snake bites me while I'm trying him. Mars Tom, I'm willing to tackle most anything that ain't unreasonable, but if you and Huck fetch a rattlesnake in here for me to tame, I'm gonna leave, that's sure. Well then, let it go if you're so bull-headed. We can get you some garter snakes, tie buttons on their tails, and pretend they're rattlesnakes. I can stand them, Mars Tom, but I wouldn't care if I didn't have them either. I never knew it was so much trouble to be a prisoner. Well, it always is when it's done right. Got any rats around here? No, sah, I haven't seen any. Well, we'll get you some rats. Why, Mars Tom, I don't want no rats. They're the most disturbing creatures, rustling around and biting your feet when you're trying to sleep. No, sah, give me garter snakes if I've got to have them, but no rats. But Jim, you gotta have them. They all do. So don't fuss about it. Prisoners aren't ever without rats. They train them, pet them, and teach them tricks. They get as sociable as flies. But you gotta play music for them. Got anything to play music on? I ain't got nothing but a coarse comb and a piece of paper and a juice harp. But I reckon they wouldn't take no stock in a juice harp. Yes, they would. They don't care what kind of music it is. A juice harp's plenty good enough for a rat. All animals like music. In a prison, they love it, especially painful music. And you can't get anything more painful than a juice harp. It always interests them. They come out to see what's the matter with you. Yes, you're all right. You're fixed very well. Play The Last Link is Broken. That'll attract rats quicker than anything else. After 2 minutes, you'll see all the rats, snakes, spiders, and things worry about you and come. They'll swarm over you and have a great time. Yes, they will, Mars Tom. But what kind of time is Jim having? I can't see the point, but I'll do it if I got to. I reckon I better keep the animals satisfied and avoid trouble in the house. Tom thought it over and then said, Oh, there's one thing I forgot. Could you raise a flower here? I don't know, but maybe I could, Mars Tom. But it's pretty dark in here, and I don't need no flower nohow, and she'd be a powerful sight of trouble. Well, you try it anyway. Some other prisoners have done it. One of those big mullein stalks might grow in here, Mars Tom, but she wouldn't be worth half the trouble she'd cause. Don't you believe it? We'll fetch you a little one. Plant it in the corner and raise it. Don't call it mullein, call it picciola. That's its right name in a prison. Water it with your tears. Why, I got plenty of spring water, Mars Tom. You don't underscore or want underscore spring water. You want to water it with your tears. That's the way it's always done. Why, Mars Tom, I lay I can raise one of those mullein stalks twice with a spring water, while another man starts one with tears. That ain't the idea. You underscore got underscore to do it with tears. She'll die on my hands, Mars Tom. She surely will, because I don't scarcely ever cry. Tom was stumped, but thought it over. Then he said Jim would have to manage with an onion. He promised to drop one, privately, in Jim's coffee pot in the morning. Jim said he'd just as soon have tobacco in his coffee. He found so much fault with it, and with the work and bother of raising the mullein, Jews harping the rats, and petting and flattering up the snakes and spiders, on top of all the other work he had to do on pens, inscriptions, journals, and things, that Tom nearly lost patience with him. Tom said he was weighed down with more gaudy chances than any prisoner ever had to make a name for himself, and yet he didn't know enough to appreciate them. They were wasted on him. Jim was sorry and said he wouldn't behave so. No more. Then Tom and I headed for bed.
Chapter 40. Rats, Ruses, and Ridiculousness. The Misadventures of Jim's Jailbreak.
In the morning, we sauntered into the village, bought a wire rat trap, and set it by the best rat hole. Within an hour, we had 15 of the finest rats you ever did see. We put the trap under Aunt Sally's bed for safekeeping, but while we were off collecting spiders, little Thomas Franklin, Benjamin Jefferson Alexander Phelps, found the trap and decided to open it. He let loose a rat parade that sent Aunt Sally climbing the walls. When we got back, she was standing on the bed, yelling like a banshee, and the rats were throwing a rave. Aunt Sally gave us a hickory switching that left us stinging for hours. We had to catch another batch of rats, but they weren't as prime as the first haul. Then came the spiders, bugs, frogs, and caterpillars. We almost snagged a hornet's nest, but its occupants were home and in no mood for visitors. After a stinging retreat, we rubbed alicum paint on our bites and pressed on. We caught a couple dozen garter and house snakes, stuffed them in a bag, and stashed it in our room. By supper, the snakes had escaped, slithering all over the house. Aunt Sally couldn't turn a corner without finding one. She hated snakes more than taxes, and every encounter had her yelping like the house was on fire. Uncle Silas was so rattled he nearly wished snakes had never been created. Even after the snakes were gone, Aunt Sally stayed jumpy. You could touch her with a feather, and she'd leap like a firecracker went off. We got a licking every time a snake showed up, but the real pain was restocking. We managed to gather a new batch of critters, turning Jim's cabin into a circus. Jim loathed the spiders, and they loathed him back, turning his nights into an endless relay of rat, snake, and spider antics. Jim swore he'd never be a prisoner again, even for a salary. By the end of 3 weeks, everything was set. The shirt was sent in via pie, and Jim scribbled in his journal whenever a rat bite woke him up. The pens were ready, inscriptions carved on the grindstone, and the bed legs sawed in two. Eating the sawdust gave us the worst stomachache, but we didn't die, though it felt like we might. With all the prep done, we were worn out, especially Jim. The old man wrote twice to a fake plantation in New Orleans, but no answer came. He decided to advertise Jim in the St. Louis and New Orleans papers, which put a chill through me. We had no time to lose. Tom said it was time for anonymous letters. "What's that?" I asked. "Warnings, we've got to give notice, like they did for Louis XVI. It adds drama." But why warn anyone? Let them find out themselves. Because they're oblivious. If we don't warn them, they won't interfere, and our hard work will be for nothing. "I prefer it that way," I said. "Shucks," Tom replied, looking disgusted. "You'll be the servant girl. Steal that yellow frock, sneak in, and deliver the letter." "But what if she only has one frock?" "Doesn't matter. You just need it for 15 minutes. "Fine, but I could deliver it in my own clothes." "You wouldn't look like a servant girl." "No one will see me." "That's not the point. We must do our duty, whether anyone sees us or not. Have you no principles?" "All right, I'm the servant girl. Who's Jim's mother?" "I am. I'll steal a gown from Aunt Sally." "But you'll have to stay in the cabin when we leave." "Not at all. I'll stuff Jim's clothes with straw to make a dummy, and Jim will wear the gown. We'll all escape together. When royalty escapes, it's called evasion." Tom wrote the anonymous letter, and I snuck the yellow frock. The letter read, "Beware. Trouble is brewing. Keep a sharp lookout. Unknown friend." The next night, Tom drew a skull and crossbones and blood on the front door and a coffin on the back door. Aunt Sally was spooked out of her wits, jumping at every noise and twitch. Tom was delighted, saying it worked perfectly. For the grand finale, we prepared another letter, but heard they'd have a guard. Tom sneaked down, found the back door guard asleep, and slipped the letter in his neck. It read, "Don't betray me. I wish to be your friend. A gang of cutthroats plans to steal your runaway slave tonight. I am one of them, but wish to quit and will betray their plan. They'll come at midnight with a false key. I will pretend to guard, but will signal you to lock them in. Do nothing but what I say, or they'll raise a ruckus. I ask no reward, but to know I've done right. Unknown friend. The stage was set. All that remained was to execute the plan and hope for the best.
Chapter 41. Fishing Fiasco. The Great Escape in the Case of the Melting Butter.
We were feeling pretty cocky after breakfast, so we grabbed my canoe, packed a lunch, and paddled across the river for a bit of fishing. It was a day of leisure, line casting and daydreaming, with the raft bobbing nearby as if it were a giant, lazy water beetle. We didn't head home until the sun dipped low, and the sky turned that perfect shade of twilight blue. By the time we reached the house, everyone was in such a tizzy, they didn't know which end was up. They hustled us off to bed right after supper, and didn't say a word about the mysterious letter that had everyone so rattled. Not that they needed to. We knew as much as anyone. Halfway up the stairs with Aunt Sally's back turned, we slipped into the cellar cupboard, packed a hefty snack, and scurried to our room. We lay low until about 11:30, when Tom donned Aunt Sally's purloined dress and got ready to leave with the provisions. Then he said, "Where's the butter?" I laid out a hunk of it, I said, on a piece of corn pone. "Well, you must have laid it out somewhere else because it ain't here." "We can do without it," I suggested. "We can do with it too," he shot back. "Slide down to the cellar and fetch it. Mosey down the lightning rod and come along. I'll stuff straw into Jim's clothes to make him look like his own mother, and be ready to bleat like a sheep as soon as you get there." Down to the cellar I went, finding the butter where I'd left it. I blew out my candle and started upstairs, stealthy as a cat burglar. But halfway up, here comes Aunt Sally with her own candle. I stuffed the butter and corn pone under my hat and clapped it on my head. She spotted me instantly. "You been down cellar?" "Yes'm. What you been doing down there?" "Nothing. Nothing. No'm." "What possessed you to go down there this time of night?" "I don't know, ma'am." "You don't know? Don't answer me that way. I want to know what you've been doing down there." "I ain't been doing a single thing, Aunt Sally. I hope to gracious if I have." Normally, she'd have let it go, but tonight she was on high alert. "You just march into that sitting room and stay there till I come. You've been up to something you've no business to, and I'll find out what it is before I'm done with you." So I shuffled into the sitting room. To my horror, it was full of armed farmers, all fidgety and uneasy, trying to look composed while obviously itching for action. They kept taking off their hats, scratching their heads, shifting in their seats and fumbling with buttons. I was on edge, wishing Aunt Sally would hurry up and get it over with. I needed to warn Tom about the hornet's nest we'd stirred up. Aunt Sally started grilling me, but I was too flustered to answer straight. Meanwhile, the farmers were debating whether to rush the cabin now or wait for a signal. The tension was suffocating, and to top it off, the butter began to melt, trickling down my face and neck. Finally, someone noticed the butter oozing from under my hat, and Aunt Sally shrieked, thinking my brains were leaking out. Everyone rushed over, and when she whipped off my hat, out tumbled the corn pone and butter. She grabbed me, relieved, and said, "Oh, what a turn you gave me. Why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have cared. Now get to bed and stay there till morning." I was up the stairs and down the lightning rod in a flash, scrambling through the dark to the lean-to. I breathlessly told Tom we had to move now. The house was swarming with armed men. Tom's eyes lit up. "No! Ain't it bully? If we'd known, we could have fetched 200 men. If only we could—" "Hurry," I insisted. "Where's Jim?" "Right here. He's dressed and ready. Let's go." We heard men fumbling with the padlock and knew we had no time. We hustled under the bed and through the hole. Jim first, me next, Tom last. Now in the lean-to, we crept to the door. Tom listened for footsteps to fade before nudging us to move. We slipped towards the fence, but Tom's breeches caught on a splinter. He had to pull loose, making a noise. Someone shouted, "Who's there? Answer or I'll shoot. We bolted. The night exploded with shouts and gunfire. Bullets whizzed past us as we dodged into the bushes. The dogs were loose, howling like banshees, but recognized us and tore ahead, uninterested. We cut through the bush to my canoe and paddled toward the middle of the river, aiming for the island where my raft was. We could hear the chaos fading behind us as we reached the raft. Jim, you're a free man now, and you won't ever be a slave again, I said. A mighty good job it was, too, Jim replied. Planned beautiful and done even better. Ain't nobody can outdo that. We were all relieved, but Tom was the happiest. He had a bullet in his leg. Jim and I weren't so thrilled. It was bleeding badly, so we bandaged him up. He insisted, man, the sweeps and set her loose. We did it elegant. But Jim and I knew better. Jim said, if it was Mars Tom who got shot, he'd say, go save me, but get a doctor for this one. Is that like Mars Tom? No. Jim ain't moving without a doctor. I knew Jim was right. I told Tom I'd fetch a doctor. He protested, but we stood firm. He relented, giving me elaborate instructions on how to bring the doctor without revealing our location. With Jim hiding in the woods, I set off to find help.
Chapter 42. The Doctor, the Deception, and Aunt Sally's Meltdown.
The doctor was an old fellow, the kind that looked like he might have mended wounds in a dozen wars, always with a kind smile plastered across his wrinkled face. I roused him up and fed him a yarn about me and my brother hunting on Spanish Island. I told him how we camped on a piece of a raft. And around midnight, Tom must have had a wild dream and kicked his gun, which went off and shot him in the leg. We wanted the doctor to patch him up without a peep to anyone, because we had grand plans to surprise our folks by coming home this evening. And who are your folks? He asked, squinting through his spectacles. The Phelpses down yonder, I replied, hoping he'd buy it. Oh, he said, and after a minute he asked, how'd you say he got shot? In his dream, I repeated. The gun went off in his dream. A peculiar dream, he mused, probably thinking we were all mad. He grabbed his lantern and saddlebags, but when he saw the canoe, he frowned. She's big enough for one, but doesn't look safe for two, he said. I assured him, oh, don't worry, sir. She carried the three of us just fine. Three? Yeah, me, Sid, and, the guns. Oh, he said again, clearly not convinced, but not willing to argue at this ungodly hour. He tested the canoe, rocking it with his foot, and shook his head. I'll look for a bigger one, he decided. Finding all the other boats locked and chained, he finally settled for my canoe, instructing me to wait or go home and get the family ready for the surprise. I waited, mulling over a plan. What if he couldn't fix Tom's leg quickly? We couldn't just sit there for days while he spilled the beans. So I figured if it took too long, I'd swim down, tie him up, and we'd shove off down the river. When Tom was patched up, we'd pay the doctor and let him go ashore. I crawled into a lumber pile and dozed off. When I woke, the sun was high. I darted to the doctor's house only to find he had left in the night. Panic set in. I dashed off towards the island, but almost collided with Uncle Silas. Tom, where have you been, you rascal? He boomed. Just hunting for the runaway slave with Sid, I lied. Your aunt's been worried sick, he said, gripping my shoulder. She needn't worry, I said. We were fine. We followed the men and dogs, but they outran us. We thought we heard them on the water, so we took a canoe, crossed over, but found nothing. We cruised up shore, got tired, tied up the canoe, and slept. We just woke up and came to hear the news. Sid's at the post office, and I'm getting us something to eat. Uncle Silas took me to the post office to fetch Sid. Of course, Sid wasn't there. The old man got a letter, and after waiting a while longer, he insisted we go home, leaving Sid to find his way back. Aunt Sally was overjoyed to see me, laughing and crying simultaneously. She hugged me, gave me one of her light scoldings, and said she'd do the same to Sid when he showed up. The house was full of chattering farmers and their wives. Old Mrs. Hotchkiss was the loudest, ranting about how the runaway slave must have been crazy, citing all the strange carvings on the grindstone. Everyone had a theory, and the cacophony of speculation and indignation was almost comical. Mrs. Hotchkiss declared the dude was crazy, while Mrs. Damrell wondered about the rag ladder. The farmers debated how the grindstone got into the cabin, each more incredulous than the last. Sister Ridgway exclaimed, "Goodness gracious, I wouldn't dare live in such a—" "I was scared stiff," Aunt Sally confessed. "I locked the boys in their room, thinking they might be stolen." Realizing Aunt Sally might ask why we weren't in our room this morning, I made a hasty exit, claiming I needed to think. Late in the day, the guests left, and I concocted a story about me and Sid sneaking out to see the excitement, getting hurt on the lightning rod, and deciding never to try it again. Aunt Sally, relieved no harm came of it, forgave us. As evening fell, Aunt Sally worried about Sid's absence. Seizing my chance, I volunteered to fetch him, but she insisted I stay put, saying Uncle Silas would go if Sid didn't return by supper. He went out and came back late, uneasy but optimistic, claiming boys will be boys and Sid would turn up by morning. Aunt Sally stayed up, watching for Sid with the light burning. When I went to bed, she tucked me in, mothering me until I felt guiltier than ever. She praised Sid, wondered if he was lost or hurt, and cried silently. I reassured her Sid would be home by morning. "The door won't be locked, Tom," she said gently. "And there's the window and the rod. But you'll be good, won't you? For my sake?" I desperately wanted to sneak out and check on Tom, but after that I couldn't bring myself to go. So I stayed, restless and worried. Twice I crept down the rod, seeing Aunt Sally waiting with her candle, eyes on the road, tears glistening. I wished I could ease her pain, but all I could do was swear never to grieve her again. At dawn, I found her asleep, her head resting on her hand, the candle nearly burnt out.
Chapter 43. Tom Sawyer's Unfortunate Bullet and the Arrival of Aunt Polly with her usual drama.
The old man was up and about town before breakfast, trying to find Tom, but coming up empty-handed. They both sat at the breakfast table, staring into their cold coffee, their faces long and mournful, like a couple of folks at a funeral who didn't really know the deceased, but showed up out of obligation. Finally, the old man says, "Did I give you the letter?" "What letter?" Aunt Sally snaps like a bear caught in a trap. "The one I got yesterday from the post office," he says. "No, you didn't give me no letter." "Well, I must have forgotten it," he mumbles, and rummages through his pockets, finally fetching the letter from some forgotten nook and handing it over. Aunt Sally's eyes light up. "Why, it's from St. Petersburg. It's from Sis." Just then, before she could open it, she drops the letter and bolts because she saw something that made her heart jump out of her chest. And I saw it too. It was Tom Sawyer, laid out on a mattress like a tragic hero, the old doctor by his side, and Jim, in Aunt Sally's calico dress, with his hands tied behind him, surrounded by a gaggle of curious onlookers. I stashed the letter behind the nearest object and rushed over. Aunt Sally threw herself on Tom, wailing, "Oh, he's dead, I know he's dead." Tom, in his usual dramatic flair, turns his head a smidge and mutters something unintelligible, which to her was a sign of life. "He's alive, thank God, and that's enough," she cries, kisses him on the forehead, and sprints to the house, shouting orders at the top of her lungs like a general in a battle. Meanwhile, I followed the men to see what they intended to do with Jim. The doctor and Uncle Silas carried Tom inside. Some of the men were fired up, wanting to hang Jim as an example to discourage other slaves from running away and causing such chaos. Cooler heads prevailed, reminding them that Jim wasn't their property, and they'd have to pay if his owner showed up. This dampened their enthusiasm for hanging him, since folks who are all gung-ho for lynching are often the least willing to foot the bill. They settled for cursing Jim and cuffing him a few times. Jim stayed silent, never acknowledging me, and they hauled him back to the cabin, dressed him in his old clothes, chained him securely this time to a big staple in the floor, and announced he'd get nothing but bread and water until his owner showed up or he was sold at auction. They even filled up our escape hole and posted guards with guns and a bulldog at the door. The doctor spoke up. "Don't be any rougher on him than necessary. He ain't a bad dude. When I found the boy, I couldn't cut the bullet out alone, and he got worse, talking nonsense and refusing to let me near him. I needed help, and this dude volunteered. He did a fine job. Of course, I figured he was a runaway, but I was stuck. I had patients with chills in town, but I couldn't leave. So I stayed with him till morning, and when some men in a skiff came by, we caught the guy while he was asleep. He's a good slave, worth $1,000 in kind treatment. Someone muttered, "Well, it sounds good, doctor. I'm obliged to say." The others softened a bit, and I was grateful to the old doctor for speaking up for Jim. They agreed Jim had acted well and deserved some recognition, promising not to curse him anymore. They locked him up again, but didn't lighten his chains or give him better food. I figured I'd tell Aunt Sally the doctor's story once I got through the immediate trouble of explaining why I hadn't mentioned Sid getting shot. Aunt Sally stuck by Tom's side all day and night. I dodged Uncle Silas whenever I saw him wandering around. The next morning, I heard Tom was better, and Aunt Sally had gone for a nap. I slipped into the sick room, ready to spin a yarn if Tom was awake. But he was sleeping peacefully, looking much better. I sat and waited for him to wake up. After half an hour, Aunt Sally came in, signaling for silence. She whispered that Tom's symptoms were first rate, and he'd likely wake up in his right mind. Soon, Tom stirred, opened his eyes, and said, "Hello? Why, I'm at home. How's that? Where's the raft?" "It's all right," I said. "And Jim?" he asked. "The same," I replied, but not too convincingly. He didn't notice and said, "Good, splendid. Now we're all right and safe. Did you tell Auntie?" I was about to lie when Aunt Sally cut in. "About what, Sid?" "Why, about the whole thing," Tom said. "How we set the runaway slave free, me and Tom." Good land, set the run. What is the child talking about? Dear, out of his head again. No, I ain't out of my head. We did set him free, me and Tom. We planned it and we done it. And we done it elegant, too. He launched into the story, and she let him ramble, staring in disbelief. "Why, Auntie, it cost us weeks of work. Stealing candles, sheets, shirts, your dress, spoons, tin plates, case knives, the warming pan, grindstone, flour, and more. We had to make saws, pens, inscriptions, pictures of coffins, anonymous letters, and get up and down the lightning rod, dig the hole into the cabin, make the rope ladder, send it in baked in a pie, send in spoons and things in your apron pocket." "Mercy sakes," she exclaimed, "and load up the cabin with rats and snakes for Jim's company. Then you kept Tom here with butter in his hat so long, you nearly spoiled the whole plan. The men came before we were out, shot at us, I got hit and we dodged the dogs, got our canoe, made for the raft, and Jim was a free man. We did it all ourselves, wasn't it, bully Auntie? Well, I never heard the likes in all my born days. So it was you underscore, causing all this trouble, turning everyone's wits inside out and scaring us half to death. I've half a mind to tan the old Harry out of you. Night after night, Just you wait till you're well, you scamp. I'll tan you both good." Tom, proud and joyful, couldn't stop, and Aunt Sally kept interjecting, both of them like a cat convention. She finally snapped, "Get all the enjoyment you can now, because if I catch you meddling with him again—" "Meddling with who?" Tom asked, dropping his smile. "With the runaway slave, of course. Who else?" Tom looked at me gravely. "Tom, didn't you just say he was all right? Hasn't he got away?" "Him?" Aunt Sally cried. "The runaway dude? No, he's back in the cabin, chained up on bread and water till he's claimed or sold." Tom rose up in bed, eyes blazing. "They have no right to shut him up. Shove! Don't lose a minute. Turn him loose. He's as free as any creature on this earth." "What does the child mean?" Aunt Sally asked. "I mean every word, Aunt Sally. If nobody goes, I will. I've known him all his life, and so has Tom. Old Miss Watson died 2 months ago. A shame she ever intended to sell him down the river, and she set him free in her will." "Say it. Then why did you want to set him free if he was already free?" "Well, that is a question, just like women. I wanted the adventure of it. I'd waded neck deep in blood for goodness alive on Polly. If she wasn't standing right there, looking sweet as an angel half full of pie, I wish I may never." Aunt Sally jumped up and hugged Aunt Polly nearly to death, crying over her. I found a spot under the bed, feeling the temperature rise. Aunt Polly shook herself free and glared at Tom over her spectacles, grinding him into the floor. "You better turn your head away, Tom," she said. "Oh, dearie me, is he changed so? Why, that ain't Tom, it's Sid." Where's Tom?" "He was here a minute ago." "You mean, where's Huck Finn? That's what you mean. I haven't raised such a scamp as my Tom all these years, not to know him when I see him. Come out from under that bed, Huck Finn." So I did, but I wasn't feeling brash. Aunt Sally looked the most confused I'd ever seen anyone, except Uncle Silas when they told him. It kind of made him drunk, and he didn't know anything for the rest of the day, preaching a nonsensical sermon that night. Aunt Polly explained who I was, and I had to tell how I ended up impersonating Tom. Aunt Sally cut in, saying, "Oh, go on and call me Aunt Sally. I'm used to it now." Aunt Polly confirmed Miss Watson had freed Jim in her will, and Tom had gone through all that trouble to free a free man. I finally understood why Tom helped set a slave free, despite his upbringing. Aunt Polly said she decided to come down the river because Aunt Sally's letters about Tom and Sid made her suspicious. Look at that now. I might have expected it, letting him go off that way without anybody to watch him. Now I got to traipse all the way down the river, 1,100 miles, to find out what that creature's up to this time. "Why, I never heard nothing from you," said Aunt Sally. "Well, I wonder. I wrote you twice about Sid being here." "I never got them, sis." Aunt Polly turned to Tom. "You, Tom." "Well, what?" he said petulantly. "Don't you, what me, you impudent thing? Hand out them letters." "What letters?" "Those letters. If I have to take a hold of you, I'll..." "They're in the trunk, just as they were when I got them from the office. I didn't touch them. I knew they'd make trouble, and thought if you weren't in a hurry, I'd... You need a good skinning, no mistake. I wrote another to say I was coming, I suppose... No, it came yesterday. I haven't read it yet, but it's all right, I've got that one." I wanted to bet $2 she hadn't, but thought better of it, so I kept quiet.
The final fiasco: freedom, fortune, and farewell.
So, there we were, in the wake of the Great Escape. And I asked Tom what on earth he had planned to do if we actually succeeded in freeing Jim, considering Jim was already free to begin with. Tom, ever the impractical dreamer, told me his grand scheme. If we got Jim out safely, we were to raft him down the river for some swashbuckling adventures, then reveal his freedom in grand style. We'd sail him back home on a steamboat, pay him for his lost time, and send word ahead to gather all the freedmen for a torchlight parade and brass band reception, making Jim a hero and ourselves legendary. Well, we got Jim out of his chains in a jiffy when Aunt Polly, Uncle Silas, and Aunt Sally found out how Jim helped the doctor nurse Tom. They treated him like royalty. They pampered him, fed him all he wanted, and didn't ask him to lift a finger. We brought him up to the sick room for a highfalutin talk. And Tom gave Jim $40 for being such a patient and good-natured prisoner. Jim was over the moon, almost bursting with joy, and said, "There now, Huck, what did I tell you? Remember back on Jackson Island, I said I got a hairy breast and it's a sign? I told you I was rich once and would be rich again, and here it is. Don't talk to me. Signs are signs. I knew I was going to be rich again as sure as I'm standing here." Then Tom, never one to let a wild idea go to waste, started talking about how we should all sneak off one night, get some gear, and head out for some hair-raising adventures with the Injuns over in the territory. I was all for it, except I didn't have a cent to my name, and I figured Pap had probably come back, cleaned out my stash with the Judge Thatcher, and drunk it all up by now. "No, he hasn't," Tom said. "The money's all there, $6,000 and more. Your Pap hasn't been back since, at least not when I left." Jim, getting all serious, said, "He ain't coming back no more, Huck." "Why not, Jim?" I asked. "Never mind why, Huck, but he ain't coming back." I kept pressing him, and finally he said, "Remember that house floating down the river? And the man inside all covered up? I went in and saw him, but didn't let you. Well, Huck, that was your Pap. You can get your money anytime you want, 'cause he's not coming back." Tom's almost healed now, strutting around with his bullet dangling from a watch guard around his neck. always checking the time like some kind of fancy gentleman. And frankly, I'm relieved there's nothing more to write about. If I'd known what a colossal headache writing a book would be, I'd have never started, and I'm certainly not doing it again. But I reckon I have to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally's talking about adopting me and civilizing me. And I can't stand that. I've been there before. The end. Yours truly, Huck Finn.
This concludes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, reimagined in the style of best-selling author Kurt Vonnegut. We hope you have enjoyed this classic book, reimagined. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. Also, check out our other Classic Books Reimagined, including Sun Tzu's The Art of War, as reimagined by Dr. Seuss. That's not something you will hear every day. Thank you for listening.